that generally involves, you know, working out what the historical pre-European veg was at the site, or what we think it was, and templating that and effectively trying to pick that up and drop that into a site. There's another camp which is talking about goal-based restoration, as in goals other than that, goals other than just purely reconstructing the pre-European plant community. It talks about interventions at scale. Obviously Andrew's touched on that a bit. It talks about a new world order in terms of changed soil, chemical, physical conditions, weed, seed loads. It talks about managing existing values. Obviously things aren't black and white. Some projects are doing both. Some projects are identifying goals and then doing pre-European veg, or some projects are managing existing values and doing the pre-European veg thing as well. So back to the landscape assessment framework. I don't have time to go into it today, other than to talk, you know, to say that it was limited in scope, taxonomic scope, to terrestrial birds. And what really came out of that was a lot of the really strong decliners tended to group into two groups. One was the low rainfall grass ecosystems that Andrew's touched on. The other was the heathlands. I'm probably not going to get too much time to talk about heathlands, but there's some good stuff to talk about with the low rainfall. So again, these are the sort of species that are really, that we think of in this landscape as associated with those low rainfall systems, things like restless flycatchers, Jackie Winters, diamond firetails, brown tree creepers, a few others, but they're the main ones. So Dan also did some work with Mark Sand, so looking at, okay, so if we accept that these areas, that these species are area limited and that there's insufficient habitat, what's a sort of area of habitat that we need to restore to have viable populations? So that we've got the how much. He also did some work through Mark Sand prioritising some parcels based on a range of pretty common sense factors. So the percentage of that sort of environmental setting in a given area, the distance from occupied patches, and obviously feeding into Mark Sand the amount of habitat required. But I guess that only gets us to the, you know, to the where and, you know, how much, which is a pretty huge figure anyway. But so what? So what do we do? That's back to the point that I raised before, which I guess brings up, you know, a question: what does good grassy woodland bird habitat actually look like? Not good grassy woodland, but what does good woodland bird habitat? The answer is we don't actually really know, but generally it doesn't look like we think it should look like. The other question, I guess, is can we actually create habitat for these species? And the answer to that might be it could be more straightforward than we think. Remember, I'm only talking about these low rainfall woodland bird species. So fortunately, the scenario I talked about isn't a hypothetical one. Thanks to our, you know, an old premier that was famous for wearing safari suits and pink shorts, we have some significant areas of public land out in the Monarto area. Franz Farm is one that's obviously the focus of our project at the moment, and we're working with the Murray-Darling Basin staff on that project. So I've highlighted two areas there, one in the north, one in the south, which having spent days and days, and other people have spent more time than me out there, are really some of the most interesting and exciting areas to watch birds, at least, and some of the most productive areas in terms of breeding. So in the centre of the picture there, we've got an area that isn't even mapped as native veg, because as Andrew said, you know, sometimes it's difficult in a sort of continuum type landscape like this. It's difficult to sort of decide where to draw a boundary and where to stop drawing a boundary. But anyways, this area has got basically all of the species that we're interested in. A lot of them are breeding, or even if we haven't seen nests, we've seen recently fledged juveniles, and David Payton would have heaps more data on this site than I do. Oops, don't know what happened there. And this is what it looks like. So to us and our perceptions, it looks pretty rubbish. It's just scattered old growth porosa, Galenia, bit of Encolina, lots of bare ground. And I know there's people in the audience who will be saying, you're always talking about France Farm, but this is some of what good grassy woodland bird habitat looks like elsewhere in the eastern Mount Lofty ranges. So around Cainton, this is the sort of habitat that supports diamond firetails, chestnut rump thornbills, brown tree creeper, southern whiteface, lots of the species we're interested in. Lots of bare ground, scattered trees. So again, this is our perceptions of good grassy woodland don't always actually match up with where the birds are spending most of their time. This is another view of the same property. Obviously there's different things happening in gullies and hilltops, but generally it doesn't really look that fantastic. This is a brown tree creeper area east of Anguston. The trees there are 50, 100 metres apart. This is the sort of habitat that brown tree creepers use, completely exotic understory. This is Jason Van Wernen's place out at Springton. This is good habitat for whiteface and diamond firetails. Obviously there's some good ground, good grassy cover there, but you know, it's not even a woodland. But again, this is our perceptions of habitat. These gully areas seem to be particularly important for diamond firetails and probably other species as well, and that could be a whole range of things, productivity, sort of run-on areas. It could be different aspects supporting different grass species that provide seeds at different times. It could be shelter, it could be anything. I guess it's not just our dodgy observations here. Some of this stuff is actually borne out in some of the published literature. Not so much in relation to, you know, these really clapped out areas, but in terms of the microhabitat preferences of some of these species. So Antos and Bennett have looked at exactly the same assemblage that we're concerned with here, because they're typically declining across their range in southeastern Australia. They found things like, you know, negative tree density being the most significant habitat variable when they compared that to randomly located plots in the same patch. So these species are preferring to forage where there's, you know, broad intercanopy spacing, where they can move around, access their prey, see predators, whatever it is that they like about that. Other authors include Possingham in that second Martin paper found in southwestern Queensland, that moderate grazing levels favoured some of these species. So obviously it's not the grazing, it's the structure. Andrew sort of touched on this before. I think we've been, you know, excited about derived grasslands for a while now, but some of these other modified states, these extensive degraded woodlands in the eastern Mount Lofty ranges, probably are not necessarily on our radar. We don't really know what to do with them. Some of our traditional interventions can actually send these areas in the wrong direction, arguably. So if I take this example of that clapped out area at France Farm, we might be tempted to go in there and control rabbits, remove stock. We might be concerned about the Galenia there. We might remove that. We could decide that some of those planted specimens aren't to our liking. We might even actually look at this as an opportunity for restoration. We might plant shrubs or chenopodds or chenopods and do other stuff. So the result of that may be an increase in tree recruitment, an increase in an annual grass sward, which a lot of these systems unfortunately have. And so academics like Andrew Bennett have postulated that for these ground foragers, that may result in reduced access to prey, reduced ability to see terrestrial predators, and reduced productivity at ground level, or all three, or any one of those. So this is another shot of France. Now, some people might look at this as a good outcome. We've had stock off for a few years. We've got senna and acacia starting to invade into some of these formerly cropped areas. Now, it might be a good outcome for something like a variegated fairy wren, probably not a great outcome for some of the species that we're concerned about, because, you know, sennas can actually quickly take over. And we're seeing that in other areas at France and other areas in the Eastern Hills. So probably good outcomes for other things, but not for the species we're concerned about. So this little graphic, it might not be able to read it too clearly, but essentially I think it's useful to illustrate in the sort of top left and top right, we have those mobile generalists. Our species generally fall into that category, mobile generalists or mobile specialists. In the bottom sort of side of the graph, there's those species that are less mobile, immobile specialists, immobile generalists. I think it just illustrates well the scale issue. Most of our conservation effort is probably in the bottom half, and for good reason. You know, we're focused on patches, but for the species that we're concerned about, we're probably not necessarily picking them up. So people say to me, yeah, that's cool. You know, we know that birds can live in these simple areas of re-veg or simple areas of remnant habitat, but what about grassland? What about other animals? Grassland reptiles also seem to be less than fussy about what species they're living in. Delma impar in the southeast, striped legless lizard seems just as happy in Phalaris and cocksfoot as it does in any other grass. There's not much left of the other stuff anyway. Same for inornata, and the list goes on. So I think it's just about identifying those values and identifying why we're doing what we're doing against the goals that we identify. I'm running out of time, but I'll just touch briefly on this. This is an example of the Monardo plantings that are now 40 years old. This is a really productive area for woodland birds, and in fact, most of the birdos that come down from town to this area go to places like Browns Road. They go to these heritage plantings because they're going off. There's a lot more here. There's a lot more going on here. This is in a run-on area. It's a sandy loam soil. There's its relationship to other sites. There's heaps going on, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a cranking woodland bird site. So what can we learn from those Monardo plantings? I think there's stuff that we already know. It's context. Obviously, they were undertaken within a matrix of remnant habitats. The scale, thousands of hectares. That's the scale at which these populations operate. The structure, the intercanopy spacing there, we've got low tree density, we've got bare ground. They're a fantastic time surrogate. Some of the work that other people are talking about, we have a time surrogate in a way here. We dismiss that stuff because it's weird, it's full of Western Australian stuff. But I think that increasingly, David Payton and his students and other people are looking more closely at these areas, trying to understand what's going on. Even down to species selection. Now, this is as an area that other people are talking about in terms of bringing in things from the arid north or doing other things. But I think in terms of specific habitat qualities, maybe there's some stuff there too in terms of, I'm not talking about bringing really weird stuff, I'm just talking about calitris, those groves, they bear off the soil. They provide nesting sites for robins and flycatchers. So they're the sorts of things that I'm talking about. That just illustrates the scale. So just briefly, the sort of work we're doing, we're working with Trees for Life on a paddock tree project where we're recognising those values. What's the issue in some of those landscapes is that there's no tree recruitment, especially the she oak systems that used to be extensive out there. So removing grazing isn't an option. So what can we do? We can do an intervention like planting individually guarded trees. That just shows the former distribution of she oak in the eastern lofty ranges against the veg mapping, of which there's pretty much none. And the other work we're doing out here at Franz is looking at those, based on what we're seeing in some of those remnant habitats and what we're seeing in some of those planted habitats, trying to translate that into some really targeted restoration action for these decliners. So we're looking at open woodland plantings. We've also re-fenced the site to enable us to keep using fencing as a grazing management tool to maintain some of those values that we're concerned about. There's going to be trade-offs there, and we're working with Carly and her team about, in a site that's this massive, 500 hectares, we can probably manage for a whole range of values, but what we don't want to see is those areas that are really productive for these grassy woodland decliners going downhill. So that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thanks, Randall. We don't have any time for questions.
Sorry about that. That was the plan.
So we're going to move straight on to our next speaker.
Fill out this form.
Our next speaker is